Hey fam, Kaya here. This is the third video and the final video in the Foundations for the Echoes Through Time series that I'll be doing. So excited. So in the last video, I introduced 10 things to remember when we study the Bible. Because as I'm going through this series, I know that there are going to probably be some things that are either outside of what you believe or they differ from maybe how you learned it, and that's okay. Um, there may be some things that you'll bring out in comments that differ from the way I learned it or what I believe. And the reason that I'm bringing this out is so that these are just some tools that we can use as we are reading the Bible to help to make us more effective. And if something is being said that is um, that is not cohesive with the message of the Bible, then it will make us, we will be more apt to hear what that is. So in the last video, I introduced 10 things to remember when we are reading the Bible. The first thing I said was while we are involved in the realization of the meaning or the actualization of the meaning, we do not determine the meaning. The meaning has already been determined. So like if someone sends you an email or sends me an email, I get that email. I don't determine what the meaning is. I might respond to it. That's the actualization, the realization of it. But I don't determine the meaning. It's the person who wrote it that determines the meaning. And it's no different from the Bible. We don't just read it and can't just pluck something out or look at it and say, oh, that's what it means because that's what I think it means. No, it means whatever it was the author meant to communicate. And that's what we have to remember when we're studying. And I use the example of Jonah. So if you want to go back and listen to video number 2, you can get a more in-depth explanation of that first principle. The second thing to remember is if the reader determines the meaning, like some people believe, then the Bible has no central message. Because if there are 20 million people with 20 million ideas of what it means, then where's the central message? It does have a central message, but it comes when we read the Bible critically and understand that there is an implied author, there's someone who wrote it, there's an implied audience, who did they write to, and what did they intend for that audience to know, and how did they intend for that audience to respond. So we have to remember all of these things. So it's not the reader that determines meaning. It's the author that determines the meaning. And if it is the reader that determines the meaning, like some people believe, then the Bible doesn't have a central message. It couldn't possibly, because everybody's going to kind of do whatever they think it means. So everybody will always be doing things different and seeing things different. And it doesn't mean that if we don't do that, then there's going to be this mystical or magical perfection of unity. It just means that if we practice this, we're much more likely to be in line with the message that was intended to be communicated, and thus not misconstrue the message or miss it altogether. Number 3, when we do create meaning, instead of uncovering the meaning, when we do create meaning, instead of uncovering the meaning, we don't grasp what the author intended to communicate. Now, this one is important because, as I said in the last video, we want to approach this like a detective. The evidence is there. We just need to uncover it. It's already been there. It's already there. We're not creating it. It's there. So I used an example of a video that was done some time ago. It was called, I think it was called Can Women Teach or something like that. And in the last video, I explained why the 2 individuals who were teaching it, why what they were saying, in what they were saying, they were creating meaning instead of uncovering what was already there. So we don't want to create meaning when we read the Bible, because the meaning's already there. So we don't need to create it. That's already been created. We just need to discover it or uncover it. And so when we approach it in a way where we are creating meaning, then we miss what the author is. We don't grasp what the author's trying to communicate. Number 4, and this goes right back to what I said, and it really is kind of, I guess, a different way of saying it. It's not the reader that creates meaning, but it's the text by way of the author. So we really want to make sure that we are reading that text. And if you want to get a more in-depth explanation, then you go back and watch video number 2. And then number five, I is we must allow the Bible to speak on its own terms, because it's only when we allow the Bible to speak on its own terms that it has the capacity to change how we see our world, to change how we see ourselves, to change our perspective, to change how we live our lives. Because as long as I hold to what I know, and that's the only thing that is true, just the way that I see it, then I can't know anything else. The minute that I know everything, I can know nothing, because whatever comes, I already know it. If I'm looking at something and say that this is, if I'm saying this is what this passage means, and someone is introducing that from another perspective, and I won't receive that, or at least listen to it, consider it, think about it, then I can't grow, because I already know everything. And so we never want to have that kind of an attitude, and we never want to approach the Bible like that when we read it. We always want to be open. And if something else comes to us, if someone else presents something in a different, from a different perspective, yeah, listen to it, because you might, it might be something that you might discover something that you didn't know, and that's I try to live by that. And then number six, and so we're going to start with number six. So again, I'm going to go to this book. This book is Introducing Biblical Hermeneutics, Scripture as Communication by Janine K. Brown. And so for number six, it is important that we affirm the reality of the text. There's a reality in the text. And then that we're also aware of our own knowledge, what knowledge we're coming to the text with, and then how we are appropriating what we're learning from the text based on what we know. So here, this is what she says. And this is number six. We can affirm both the reality of what stands in the text and the subjective nature of our knowledge or appropriation of that reality. So we can affirm what actually stands in the text, but at the same time as affirming what stands in the text, we can also affirm the subjective nature of our own knowledge, because our knowledge is based on things. It's subjective. It's based on what we know. It's based on our experiences. And based on what we know, there's a way that we're going to appropriate or use what we understand the reality of the text to be. So we need to really, I think a simple way of saying that is we need to perceive our own perception. Why do we have the perceptions we have? And how do the perceptions that we have, how do those impact how we perceive what the author is communicating in the Bible itself when we read it? So that might be a better way of understanding what I'm trying to say for number six. It's just to perceive our own perception and understand that our perceptions are subjective. What are the factors that determine why we're understanding something that way? What has determined the knowledge with which we come to the Bible? And based on that knowledge, how are we appropriating or using what we are learning from the text itself? So there is a reality that exists in the text, but how are we appropriating that based on what we know? Number seven, without claiming absolute knowledge for our interpretation, we can attain adequate knowledge. Interpreters may not know everything, but they often know enough to understand a text and to respond to it appropriately. So while the Bible was written in a certain culture, a certain time, in a certain language, we don't speak that language. We don't live in that culture. We don't live in that time. So we can do our best to step into it. And while we might not be able to understand everything perfectly, while we may not be able to understand everything perfectly, we can understand some things, which I'll get to in a minute. But what we do understand, we never want to claim that that's absolute knowledge. We always want to approach the Bible in humility, because anything that I am presenting, any concept that I'm presenting, it really is it's a perception that I have based on hopefully what I'm laying out, adequate evidence for what I am laying out. But still, at the same time, it is based on my own subjective knowledge. So I never would say that this is truth. Like, this is the absolute truth and there is no other truth. So what we never want to say, without claiming absolute knowledge for our interpretation, we can attain adequate knowledge. So we can attain adequate knowledge, but the adequate knowledge that we attain, let's not ever say that it's absolute knowledge. Okay? So that is number 7. So we want to use humility, and this is going to come up again. And then number 8, I had mentioned this just a second ago. I kind of got those two things together. Number 7 and number 8. While we may not fully or perfectly understand our responsibility as disciples when it comes to our study, we should still make sure that we are doing our very best to understand. So here she says on page 126 at the top, and I'm going to actually read this part again so that we can just see how these things flow together. Interpreters may not know everything, but they often know enough to understand a text and to respond to it appropriately. The goal of understanding the author's communicative intention is a worthy and responsible goal. That we will not fully or perfectly reach it is no reason to give up trying. In fact, we should work diligently to hear as best as we are able the voice of the scripture that often contravenes our own, that often undermines our own, that often it may not necessarily agree with our own. And we need to be open to that. That is really the way that we grow. When we read something or hear something from a different point of view, and we step out of what we've always known and we're willing to examine, to consider, without just kind of lunging at it and saying, no, that's not true. If we're willing to consider it, that is actually the way we grow. Because as long as we're not willing to consider, then we just can't grow. We can't. Because the only way that we can develop new ways of thinking is when we are willing to embrace new information. And then potentially we will have new ways of thinking, new ways of being, new ways of living. But until we do that, we won't be able to grow. So just because we may not understand it perfectly, we still want to continue to diligently seek out what the meaning of whatever text that we're reading. We want to continue to diligently seek out the meaning of it. So that is number 8. Number 9, we have an ethical responsibility to acknowledge the intended message of the author. And I'm going to read something else here that Janine K. Brown wrote that I thought was really good. If we view the Bible as a communicative act and not simply an autonomous text disengaged from its author, we are ethically bound to grant the author the privileges due more routinely to all communicators. This means respecting the author's communication through the text as a voice distinct from our own, what we have referred to as the other. So there's our voice, what we're hearing, based on what we're perceiving, but then there's the other. There's what the author intended to communicate. That's the voice that we really want to key into and listen to. So it's what we refer to as the other. In this ethical stance, the reader is responsible for his or her response to the other and the other's act. We are often tempted to conform the other to our own ways of being. How many times do we open the Bible and we look at it and go, that's what it says, without thinking at all what the author was trying to communicate, and we conform it to what we think rather than our thoughts being conformed to what it says. Yet the moral imperative in the midst of this temptation is to hear Scripture in a way that allows Yah, through its witness, to examine and shape us so that we become conformed to the other. What is the author trying to communicate? For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So, number 9, we have an ethical responsibility to hear the voice of the other, to conform our thoughts to it, and not to try to conform the voice of the other to what we think. And then last, number 10, we must approach the Bible on its own terms. And this is what Janine K. Brown says at the bottom of page 127. Part of what it means to approach the Bible on its own terms is allowing the text to speak first in its own context. What is the context it's speaking in? What is the culture? What is the world? What is the language? Who are the people? What is going on? We've got to be able to determine that. What is the author trying to say? What is going on in the larger, what surrounds it? What's the social setting? What's the political setting? What is going on? All these things have to be determined. So part of what it means to approach the Bible on its own terms is allowing the text to speak first in its own context. Hearing the text as other will involve paying close attention to the issues of the Bible's genre, language, social world, and literary context, as these would have been understood in its original settings. And then she goes on to say, in our next chapters, we will take on these 4 topics in some depth. Our goal in attending to these issues is not to objectify the text, but to put ourselves in the position of understanding in the best possible way what the authors of the scripture were communicating. What were they communicating? So that we are able to hear their messages well. It is the personal obligation owed to the scripture. And so it is important that we remember that we must approach the Bible on its own terms. And I think there was one other thing that I did not read, that I'm just going to throw it out there. It was actually supposed to be a number 4, but I think it fits well. If we are routinely experiencing the Bible as non-threatening platitudes, if it's not challenging us, if it's not challenging our mindset, our thought process, if it's not challenging the way we live, if it's not challenging any of that, if we are routinely experiencing the Bible as non-threatening platitudes rather than a wake-up call to new ways of thinking, being, and doing, we are probably not reading well. And so I think that goes with what I just said. Number 10, we must approach the Bible on its own terms, because far too often we don't. And if we are not reading it well, we're probably reading it where we are bringing our presuppositions and molding what is being said to what we think, rather than allowing what we think to be molded to what is actually being said. So to recap real quick on 6 through 10, we can affirm the reality of what's in the text. Also, while we also affirm and we also become aware of what knowledge we're bringing and how that knowledge is impacting how we understand what we're reading, and then how we're utilizing the knowledge that we're gaining. Number 6, that was 6. Number 7, there is no absolute knowledge. We want to approach the Bible in humility as we read it. And we can understand it, we can study it out the best that we can. But we always want to have a humble spirit and never take our finite perception as absolute knowledge and project that onto the text, and then somehow think that there's something wrong with other people and they don't see it that way. Number 8, while we may not fully or perfectly understand everything that we're reading, we still want to be good stewards in trying. So we want to continue to read, continue to study, and be diligent in that. Number 9, that was number 8. Number 9, we have an ethical responsibility to the author to acknowledge that they are trying to communicate a specific message and find out what that message is, so that we can better ascertain what the meaning of the text is, so that we will be more adequately apply it correctly to our lives. And then number 10, we must approach the Bible on its own terms. So it is me approaching the Bible on its own terms, hearing what it says and conforming my thoughts, my mind, my heart, my ways of living to it, and not me projecting what I think on it and conforming it to the ways that I think. So that's the end of that. Those are the 10 things to remember when we are studying the Bible. I hope that those will be a help. I hope those will be a blessing. And I am looking forward to this series, Echoes Through Time, uh, and the things that we're going to learn, the concepts that we're going to build, that we're going to see from the book of Genesis that are threaded throughout the Bible, the things that the Most High has been saying for eons, just through the eons of time, that he's never stopped saying. And in doing so, in hearing those echoes and seeing what he's been saying through the eons of time, establishing a cohesive central message for scripture that will allow us to understand the Bible better because we see it more holistically, to conform our hearts and minds to it, and to live according to the will of the Most High, to please him in all that we say, all that we do, how we live, and how we conduct ourselves. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. I'm going to say shalom, and we will talk in the next video. May the Most High bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you. May he give you peace. May he give you wisdom. May he be good to you and show you his mercy. And we will talk in the next video. Have a wonderful evening. Shalom.